Okay. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Today is January 13th, Friday, the 13th. And
Со Старым Новым годом!
да, и со Старым Новым годом, точно, со Старым Новым годом. So I'm very happy to see some of our members of the CTR here today for a very exciting event. This is the second roundtable of the series of roundtables dedicated to the specific questions and specific the topic which we have been exploring since December. This is hearing the voices of our colleagues from diverse backgrounds in the field. And the questions which we are going to explore today include, but not of course limited to the following questions: how the unique backgrounds and professional experiences of our colleagues with diverse backgrounds have been affecting their learning of the language, the teaching of the language, their teaching practices, and how the experiences help everyone create more diverse, these experiences and how we can use these experiences in order to create more diverse and inclusive Russian language classrooms. So today we have three presenters. Unfortunately, Devin Brown was not able to come today, and I'm briefly going to tell who these presenters are, and then we'll give them an opportunity to talk about themselves. We give them a chance to share about themselves, about their experiences. So we have the first person is Raquel Green, who is a member of the CTR board member. She's also the chair of the DEI committee of the CTR. She's an associate professor and department chair of Russian at Grinnell College. And she's interested in language pedagogy, Russian literature and culture, and children's literature. And she's also known as a scholar of the interplay of race, ethnicity, and culture. The second presenter today is David Parker, who is an assistant teaching professor of Russian studies at Carnegie Mellon University, and whose academic interests include 20th century Russian prose, late Soviet literature and popular culture, Yugoslav modernism, and Russian language pedagogy. So David comes to us not only with the Russian studies background, but also with knowledge of Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, Montenegrin, BCMS. And finally, we have Jose Vergara, who is an assistant professor of Russian in Bryn Mawr College, at the Department of Russian. He's the author of All Future Plunges to the Past, James Joyce in Russian Literature, published in 2021 by Cornell University Press. His teaching interests cover a wide variety of topics: Russian language, prison literature, Chernobyl, Russian novel of the classical and experimental varieties, and contemporary Russian culture and society. So we shared the questions with our presenters in advance. So, and I'm going to say these questions out loud, and then we'll give a chance to all our presenters to respond to these questions, if it's fine. So the first one: how did your unique background and professional experiences impact your study of Russian and or your teaching practices? Okay, so whoever wants to start first. Raquel, I'm calling on you.
Sure, thank you. I was born and raised in the Bronx in New York City in the 1980s. I am of African American heritage, and I attended the Bronx High School of Science, where the focus was on the sciences. But in choosing to study a foreign language, I had studied Spanish throughout elementary school through junior high school. And I just decided to study something different. The Cold War was still ongoing. And so that was really what the attraction was. And that was it. And during, I believe it was my sophomore year of Russian, we had a unit on Pushkin. And my teacher, talked about his background and talked about the fact that he was of African ancestry. And we read some of his poetry. And that was really the draw for me initially. And when I was getting ready to graduate, she just, pulled me aside after class one day and said, I don't know where you'll go from here, but I really hope you keep up the Russian because you seem to enjoy it and you're doing really well. And so I just sort of stuck that in the back of my memory. It was not some sort of profound discussion. It was probably about a minute, if that. But when I got to college, I continued with the sciences. And what I found was that I struggled. And I didn't understand why I was struggling. I thought, I did a lot of this, or I thought I had done a lot of this and I had done it well in high school. And it was just a really tough time for me when I started off in undergraduate, when those courses weren't going along very well. But in the back of my mind, I remembered what my Russian teacher had said. And I thought, you know what? I think I'll start taking up Russian again. And I loved it. And I realized that the sciences were not for me. And so I wound up being a Russian major. And I decided to pursue it in graduate school. And so that's pretty much what got me to where I am today. I got a master's and then decided to go on for my PhD. And that's it.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you. So, David or Hasse, would you like to share a little bit about your backgrounds and how did you get into the Russian studies and why did you decided to learn Russian?
We could go in alphabetical order, if that's okay, Jose. So I guess my background is Japanese American. I would call myself, my great-grandparents were born in Japan. So for the most part, I'm very American. I've been to Japan one time in my life. All the Japanese I know, I took in college at the same time I was taking Russian. So I feel very culturally American, but I don't look entirely, American in a certain sense. I don't, I look kind of in between. Or I guess, when I went to Russia, I would ask people, what do you think I look like? And they would just say, oh, I think you look half Japanese. And I'll say, well, that's because I already told you I don't have Japanese. But I guess that was my fault for, kind of giving away the question. But I was looking back and I think there's three really interesting maybe reasons for me to study Russian that I'm going to list, but I have to say that none of them were ultimately the reason why I chose to study Russian. So first, I was born and raised in Anchorage, Alaska. So of course, there's an immediate Russian connection, you might think, but really growing up in Alaska, it was mostly expressed in place names. So when I was a kid, I would go fly kites at Point Woronzof when I was a little kid. It was only 20 years later in an 18th century Russian literature class, I realized, wait a minute, it's not Point Woronzof, it's Vorontsov, it's named after Graf Vorontsova. So, I was from Alaska, didn't really, I didn't feel the Russian presence or the Russian history legacy as much as you might think. My aunt on my father's side, she studied Russian at University of Washington and studied abroad in the Soviet Union in Leningrad, 1978. But again, as a child, I mostly thought it was funny that my aunt could do a Russian accent as like a little kid. So that didn't really influence me to study Russian as well, even though I have a family connection there. And I think one of the most interesting ones that I'd only learned about much later is that my mother, who's Japanese American, her uncle, George, in the late 1930s, he was born in America, but he went back to Japan to help out his family. And then during that time, Japan, the Empire of Japan, became involved in border clashes with the Soviet Union in northern China, and he was drafted into the Japanese army and was captured by the USSR and spent several years, I think until the 1950s, early 50s, he was living in a POW camp in the Soviet Union. And I only learned about this much later after I started studying Russian. So I have these kind of strange connections with Russia, but ultimately, I decided to study Russian because I liked Russian literature and I liked reading about World War II history as a high schooler in Alaska. So that's my background. I can talk, but I'll talk more about that, how my actual, background impacted my study of Russian in a bit.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Jose.
So first, I just want to say thank you to ACTR and Olga for inviting me to participate and for hosting this series. It's really great. And I think, I'm not sure if we're doing the general introduction question or the second one, but I'm just going to combine both of them if that's okay. So answering it in two ways or two different parts. How did I get to Russian? I think like David, I didn't have any particularly good reason or any obvious connections to it. Other than in high school, I read Crime and Punishment, like so many people, and Lolita, and was just floored by both of them for very different reasons, and had this kind of passing interest in Russian literature and Russian culture, but I had no direct connection. I think the closest thing, what I always say, is that my uncle, not by blood, was in oil, and he had spent some time in Russia and said he spoke Russian, but he didn't. I don't know, maybe he did. But that was it. Then I went to college at the University of Missouri, Columbia, to the J School, the journalism school. I thought that's what I wanted to do, but quickly realized it was not for me. It took, I don't know, a couple months to recognize that I wanted a different course of study. I wanted a department that was smaller and had more community. I think we all, hopefully, all feel that way about our Slavic Russian programs, that sort of community feel. And I wanted material that engaged me in a different way. So I was looking through the course catalog, which was on paper still at that point, and saw a course on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, signed up for it, and that was, essentially a life-changing moment. It was an incredible class. The professor was amazing. So it just kind of hooked me, and I spoke to the undergraduate advisor, Nicole Monnier, and really liked what she had to say about the program and her as a person, as a professor. So I started taking the language, continued with that, taking as many classes as I could. I even took Old Church Slavonic, which was intense, probably a mistake, but it was part of that experience. Literature, history, all those sorts of things, and just ran with it, and ended up at the University of Wisconsin-Madison for graduate school, and in terms of teaching, received training from Karen Evans Romain and Anna Tumarkin, all of which was wonderful. And so kind of looping back, thinking about the question of my background and kind of these experiences, like I said, in some ways, I feel like my experiences are the same as many of our colleagues, but in other ways, they're not, in important ways too. They differ. So before all that, I was born in Bogota, Colombia, in the late '80s, and moved to the United States with my mom when I was about 6. And when we got to Texas, I was enrolled in a bilingual program, so speaking Spanish and English to some extent, I don't remember, for 2 years, kindergarten, first grade, and then switched out. And maybe that was just the way it worked. Maybe, I don't know, for whatever reason, it was just those 2 years. And after that, English language and American culture really won out in a general sense for me. I can still understand Spanish and speak it to some extent, but not without difficulty. And then when I added Russian into the mix, even more difficulty, this interference there. I remember conversations with my grandmother where Russian pronouns would come in, and I would use vowel reduction, and I would really confuse her. But just the way it went. So anyway, I was an immigrant kid. I was young when we moved in, but I wanted to fit in. I adopted an American or Americanized name, not Jose. I was kind of nervous about my background and how I would fit into this culture and this new school system, et cetera. So growing up, this was always kind of in the back of my mind, even without realizing it or having the terminology for it, or the concepts. And then adding Russian into the mix, things got even more complicated as I'm trying to navigate in college who I am and my identity and my heritage and what I am, I guess, essentially, or what I want to be. And I started to think more critically about all this and wanted to recover my Colombian and Latino heritage. And I think it really wasn't until I started studying Russian and a few years into that, when I went to Middlebury and even starting grad school, that this all kind of came and clicked, I guess, in my mind. I returned to Jose in Russian. And at least partly, I think, is this freedom that we experience when we're learning languages to experiment, to play in another language, to adopt, to some extent, another identity that kind of granted me a way back in to my identity and to kind of think about what I wanted in those terms, in terms of these questions. So in brief, I think for me, my study of Russian, that experience, along with my research, even now, is really intimately tied to these questions of identity, of making sense of who I am.
Okay, thank you so much. And after listening all this interesting and unique backgrounds about the unique and interesting individual backgrounds and experiences, I would like just to continue with the question about the teaching practices, how they were affected by your choices made early in your career, right? When you decided to choose to study Russian and Russian studies, got into Russian studies. So how these your background, your experiences were affecting and still continue affecting your teaching practices, and also how do they help you to support your own students, your own learners in the classroom? Raquel, we'll just follow Raquel and David and then Jose, the same order.
I think one thing when I was thinking about this that stands out in terms of my study and in terms of how I try to relate to my students is just remembering or recalling the invisibility of Black people, right? Within the context of Russian culture and Russian literature. And it was not until I really started thinking about my dissertation topic, and I told, my advisor, I said that, this is what I'm interested in. And the one thing that she thought, you could do some good work on is Pushkin, and, look at his African ancestry, but look at it in a different way. So look at it within the context of, alienation, marginalization, these things. And that's what I decided to do my research on. But one of the first texts that I came across in just, doing general research was called Russia and the Negro by Alison Blakely. And that text really just transformed the way that I looked at the field, because it's a really accessible in terms of, the language, the writing. It's not this really dense scholarly work, but it just gives a broad overview of the history of Russia and the African diaspora. So I came across names and movements that I wasn't really that familiar with, that I didn't know very well. And what I did was, much of what I found wasn't necessarily helpful in terms of my dissertation research, but I put it to the side and I said, you know what, one day I'm going to come back to this text. And I'm going to come back to a lot of the names and the movements that he referenced. And that's what I did. And the first, thank you, Olga. And the first course that I taught once I left, when I was finishing up my dissertation and I had gotten to Grinnell, the first course I taught was the theme of the African in Russian literature and culture. And the course was based for the most part on references, not just to Pushkin, but to Blackness in general, the theme of Blackness, the experience of African Americans and other people from the African diaspora in Russia. And that was how I began my teaching career. And one of the things that I found early on is that students, you know, they saw the title of the course and would never think that that was even, you know, they would call it, that was even a thing, right, in Russia. And so, you know, and I had a number of students of color, and I've generally, you know, always had, when I've offered it, had a fair number of students of color. And one thing that invariably they want to talk about is the experience, the real lived experience of people of color in Russia. And so it's an interesting thing to talk about it. I talk about it in African diasporal terms, and, you know, try to compare in some ways the experiences of, you know, Black people in this country and what Africans in Russia might be experiencing. And it comes up again when we talk about study abroad. Because certainly when I went to Russia for the first time decades ago at this point, we didn't talk about what a person of color might expect, what they might experience. So, you know, I just went and found out a lot of things on my own. And so now it's funny, we had a not departmental discussion, but I talked to my other colleagues who were chairing other language departments, and just asked them, you know, what do you do to train your students, to prepare your students, students of color who are studying abroad? What do you do to prepare them? None of my colleagues, none of them said that their departments did anything. And my department was guilty of the same thing. And so students at Grinnell, they felt that something was lacking in terms of how they were being prepared. And they set up a panel, which is held every year, I believe, which is comprised of students who are returning from study abroad, students of color, just talking about their experiences and what they wished the college had told them before they went abroad. And one student actually, he spoke in very, very strong terms, but he said he felt that the college was negligent, that he went to, and I forget the country, it was in South America, but he said he went as a student and was totally unprepared for what he experienced as an African-American man. And so that is something that, I've talked about with my colleagues and thought, what do you say to students? What do I tell students, students of color who are choosing to study in Russia? And the answer that I've come up with, and I don't know if it is the best answer, but when on the occasion when I've had Black students who've chosen to study, what I say to them is, think about yourself as a person of color in this country, and think about the microaggressions that you experience, perhaps on a daily basis, and think about the coping skills that you have developed probably from pretty early on, depending on, where in the country you were raised. Think about those coping skills. And I would say that if you feel comfortable in terms of how your skills have developed here, I think that you can handle, right, what you may or may not experience when you get to Russia. A lot of that will depend on what city you choose to study in, right? If you're in a large city, as opposed, Moscow as opposed to, Vladimir, right? I mean, there are a lot of different variants that are important. But what I say to them is, your experience as a person of color in this country and the way in which you have managed to thrive and to cope with what you might be dealing with on a daily basis, that should empower you, right? So you should go to Russia expecting to have a great experience, but with the understanding that these things may happen. You may be stared at, in the metro, people may say things to you on the street, right? And I think that is an answer that I think a lot of them have actually found useful and helpful, but it's something that, like, as I said, when I was when I traveled to Russia for the first time, no one, talking about these things, no one did it. You just sort of went and experienced what you experience. And now that I'm actually trying to be intentional, right, about what I say and the advice that I give, it's made me more thoughtful about how I approach these things. I think I might have gotten off topic.
Mhm.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. But it was very, very helpful, Raquel. Thank you. So, David, you're next.
Yeah, that was incredibly helpful, Raquel, for myself. And because I think everyone's experiences are so completely different. And in my own case, I wasn't sure what people would take me for, but there was always some kind of there was a kind of a flexibility, not a flexibility, there was an element of chance. I think for certain people, I think for African American students studying in Russian, many of them, there's not going to be, Russians will identify them immediately as having African heritage. But one thing that my experience learning Russian has really shown me is that my own impression of Russia, I'm not going to say, the impression that I was given in classes, I'm not going to blame the curriculum of, the Russian programs in America, but just what I was interested in Russia did not prepare me for how Asian Russia could be at times, if that makes sense. So, I read a lot of Russian literature. I watched Russian movies before I went abroad. I was very nervous before going abroad. And I kept a diary at the time. And I think in the airport, I wrote something down like, the image of Russia in my head is going to, like crash. I think I tried to quote Mayakovsky or something, like crash against a buit, like Lyubovnaya lotka разбилась об buit or something like that. Very dramatic. Of course, I was very dramatic. I was 20 years old at the time. But I studied abroad in Irkutsk, and I'm very glad I did, because just everyday life there, I just see certain scenes that I don't think you can really prepare yourself for. Just in positive ways. There's a very large Buryat population in Irkutsk, and of course in the neighboring Buryat Republic. It's the people that I had never heard of before I was preparing to go abroad. I would see a lot of friendships, just people walking down the street, Buryat and Russian ethnic things. So I'm kind of focusing on positive things now. Of course, there are a lot of negative things, but there's just little things in everyday life that I wouldn't expect. Like when my host mother's neighbor, who was Russian, ethnically Russian, offered me some seaweed, not actually as this kind of like, oh, you're Asian, do you want seaweed? But just because she happened to have a lot of seaweed. I said, oh, I didn't know that people ate seaweed here. And that was just something maybe that had come about. It made its way west to Irkutsk. but you know, Irkutsk was, I've studied about in Irkutsk, in Moscow, in Kiev, and I've spent time in Uzbekistan. And one thing I always want to stress to my students is how different my experience was in all of those places. Because, you know, you have your identity, but your appearance, it makes up only so much of your identity. But so much of your experience in the country is going to depend on how other people identify you, if that makes sense. So, you know, in Irkutsk, I wasn't even sure what if people thought I was Buryat, if they thought I was Uzbek. In Moscow, I was worried, and maybe I internalized some of the racism of Russians. I was worried about being taken as being from Central Asia, because I knew that they generally had the worst experience, you know, the worst discrimination against them. And several times, I do believe that the only times I was stopped by the police was in Moscow. And I do think it was because they thought I was from Central Asia, until they saw my passport. And then, of course, then their whole demeanor changed when they saw I actually wasn't from Tajikistan, but from America. In Kiev, you know, I had a very lovely experience there, but it was very strange for me to be speaking Russian at the time. This was 2013. I was there to practice my Russian, but I saw, you know, no Asian people. And I was with a colleague, he's Korean American, and he remarked to me that he said, you know, it's not just that everybody here is white, it's that everybody has kind of a Slavic face. It was just kind of strange experience to be in, because I now began to associate speaking Russian and being in a Russian-speaking country with this kind of, you know, some kind of diversity, ethnic diversity, actually. And then the strangest thing, I think, was when I went to Uzbekistan, everyone tried to speak Uzbek with me. And, you know, in the airport, I asked them, do I need to take off my shoes in Russian? And they just kept answering me in Uzbek. And finally, I just said, I'm not Uzbek. I don't understand what you're saying. And then I just went to the metal detector anyway, because they wouldn't speak Russian to me. So I think for me, it's always a surprise how people are going to identify you. And I think, Raquel, those skills that you identified, I think it's good to kind of to give the agency back to the student and say, you know how to navigate these things in this country, because we can't tell them, oh, people in this country will accept you like that. And actually, in the microaggressions that they will face will be very different. I think, some things that you might have even thought of about, what I'm trying to say, they might hold these certain prejudices about you that you didn't even know were stereotypes about your ethnic group, if that makes sense. But you'll have to learn how to deal with that. But you might already be equipped to deal with them. So that's in terms of study abroad. I think I'll let Jose speak, and then I can talk about the way I look at curriculum here in the States. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, when I was thinking about the second question, a number of things came up, some of which I think overlaps with what Raquel and David have said. One of these things that came to mind was this kind of standard question that I receive, I think to this day even, why? Your name is Jose, why are you studying Russian? Why not Spanish? Which in the grand scheme of things is not the biggest deal, but certainly frustrating on some level. And even worse, I think there was one moment when I was TAing for a course in grad school and meeting a guest speaker who's flying in from somewhere for lunch with the professor. And I think we had corresponded, or she had seen my name, but when I was introduced to her, she said, "Oh, you're Jose, you don't look like what I imagined," or something like that, which was this weird moment. So I mentioned these things because I think in terms of the second question, what's on my mind is that I want to support my students in the sense of not being boxed in, right? That they can use the language to express themselves and to express whatever identity they want to stay on that topic, to use this language in these different ways. Maybe using it as an opportunity to redefine themselves, their identity, and so on. Feeling free to express themselves when they get to college in ways that they don't. Some of them might not be able to at home. in terms of gender identity and so on. And what also came to mind, or thinking of ways that I try to practically support this, is I think different assignments that are more creative, like video projects, these sorts of things that they're tasked with expressing themselves. And even if it's not about themselves, I think this opportunity to get playful with the language and create is important in terms of this question. And in general, all this makes me wonder about how to support and bring in more of these students, because I think sometimes because of those questions that, like the one I get, or other people I'm sure in this room and elsewhere get, like why Russian, not why not Japanese or whatever it might be, or Spanish. I want my students to feel that Russian's for them, no matter where they come from or what background. The study of Russian can be for everyone, and that we should convey to them, I guess, the benefits of studying Russian, whether it's academic or professional or personal even. And finally, one thing that came to mind, another thing that came to mind was at UW, I was really fortunate to be for 3 years the writing instructor assistant for the Pushkin Summer Institute, which some of you are maybe familiar with, but it's a pre-college program, intensive pre-college Russian language and culture and writing program, composition program for high school students with populations that are predominantly Latino and or Black. So I hope, I can't, and I don't want to speak for any of those students, but I hope, and I feel like that's the sense I got, that, representation matters. And even if I didn't look like many of them, still having someone who was a Latino American immigrant who was, continues to study Russian, was important to them, was special. And I don't know, this background and these kinds of experiences just makes me want to be a mentor for those sorts of students, to retain those kinds of students who have, family pressures or other pressures to move on from Russian to the sciences or to other topics. So I think, and this is stating the obvious, but the question is how do we do this collectively as a field?
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So the next question we are going to address, hopefully, it's related to the your language teaching and your language curriculum development. So if you can share a few specific examples of how you integrate your diverse backgrounds and experiences into teaching language and language curriculum, this will be wonderful. Thank you. Mhm. Raquel, would you like to start?
Sure. One of the things that, because, as Jose said, representation matters. And I think it matters in terms of what we teach, how we teach. And I try to start just incorporating issues of diversity, even at the beginning levels, which is a challenge, right? Because they're not very proficient in terms of language yet. So what I have started to do is to use children's literature. So we'll start with something that isn't very difficult, like Chukovsky, right? For example, but even beyond the text that I introduce, I often use illustrations and point out that illustrations are a text. They are a visual text. So what can we glean? What can we try to glean from the illustrations of a number of texts that we look at? And knowing, and we talk a little bit about Soviet history, and they know some, but thinking about the early period in the Soviet Union and the messages surrounding race and acceptance and international brotherhood, and thinking about these things. What do the texts of these children's stories, what do they tell us, right? Are they in line with what the messaging, right, was, or is it different, right? And so unfortunately, a lot of these early text illustrations are incredibly racist. So they're problematic in a lot of ways, but I just find them to be useful in terms of, thinking about how Soviets viewed race, especially in the early period of the Soviet Union. And then in a more contemporary context, we watch cartoons. And again, with cartoons, and there's one in particular from Nupa Gadi, where you don't have to worry about language because there isn't language, right? You're just going on the basis of the visual. And what is the visual telling us, right? How is race being constructed? And during those class sessions, I allow time every week, usually it's on a Friday, to talk about, to spend a few minutes just talking about culture, right? In a broad sense. So that's when I would use either, one of these children's texts or look at a cartoon that deals with race, and we talk about it. We may spend 5 or 10 minutes, right, discussing something that I have given them the link to beforehand so that they've watched it for homework. And then when we come to class, I'll just say, well, what do you think? What's the message that we are being given here in terms of how, one of the messages that we are given in terms of how Russians view race. And so we've had some very, very interesting conversations. And I think that students, when they come to the language, they don't necessarily know that Russia is a multi-ethnic country. And so when you begin to introduce these different images and different, and different constructions of race and ethnicity, it's really fascinating for them. So I put these things, I disperse them throughout my syllabi so that we spend time talking about it over the course of the semester.
Thank you. So thank you, Raquel. This is really interesting to see also how you integrate culture into the language class, which is also very difficult task sometimes, right? And we forget to do this as teachers of language, to incorporate culture in our language lessons. David, so if you can take over.
Sure.
Great.
I wanted to start by sharing a few times where my own experience was actually not helpful and kind of got in the way. So one really recent and relatively recent and embarrassing example was that it was the beginning of the third semester of Russian, so Russian 2, the fall semester, and we had a unit in the textbook where we were talking about our families and family history. And one of the textbook questions was, go around the room and describe, where were your great grandfather born, where were your ancestors from, what country they're from originally, and everybody answered the question very as best they could. And then I have one student who was Black, and he just said, I don't know what country they were from, and I should have just seen that ahead of time. I should have just done a little bit of due diligence and looked at the questions and thought, this is not, you can say, oh, my identity, I'm a Japanese American, I'm know what village I think my great grandfather's from. I'm very excited about that in a typical American way. What part of Ireland are you from, or things like that. But it's not a universal experience at all. So that was something, I won't make that mistake again, but I might make a similar kind of mistaken, I'd rather not. So, I want to just remind myself to, look at the, if we use textbooks all the time, but it would have been very easy to just, I made slides off of the textbook, so it wasn't even a copy of it. So I could have just written that question out a little differently. I don't think it, the student, I don't think it affected him, but he did. Well, he actually, I don't know. I should have, I didn't want to talk to him about it or anything, but something I'll remember. And then another thing, not quite as I would say is bad, but just something I've been reminded of is I approach Russian as an American, but increasingly I have more and more students, that are international students. And I had one semester when I was a grad student at Berkeley, I had 2 students from China who I really enjoyed teaching. But I realized that, they have, of course, having grown up in China, a completely different image of Russia in their mind. And also, even between the 2 students, they were good friends, but they were very different in their own interests in Russia. So even though they have, a Chinese view of Russia, the one from northern China was very interested in business and wanted to basically go back and do business with the Russians in northern China. And the one from southern China was really, I think she identified as a socialist, really liked anime, a Russian character in an anime. She wrote a lot of her essays about. And so even though she had a completely different interest in Russia, she liked Russian culture, specifically Soviet. She really liked Ostrovsky. And the one from northern Russia hated Ostrovsky and said, "Oh yeah, we had to read him too. I hated that." So they had totally different views of Soviet culture even, but they did have, they were presented the same one, just had different opinions. So that reminds me, to try to get away from my American perspective of Russia. I really enjoyed what you said, Raquel, about culture, because it is very difficult, I think, sometimes to have time to give, not only to give the Russian culture, the great Russian culture lesson, but to have a different Russian culture, to give a different perspective. And so one way that I try to have some kind of representation without even to kind of sneak it in there, because it is difficult to have time for culture, is I just try to really expand the geographic scope of my lessons sometimes. So if we are doing weather, I recently found a great video. YouTube is such a great resource. Obviously, I don't need to tell other language teachers that, but of a market in Yakutsk. It's like a fish market, and it's just an amazing video because it's -60, well, maybe -40, and they're selling fish, these giant exotic, taimen fish, and the sound that the fish make when they scrape against each other is so interesting. And I think my students really enjoyed it. This is just an illustration of the word, cold. But all the sellers are, they're Yakuts, so they don't look like typical people in their textbooks at all. They look, more like me, and more like some of my students. So I try to, whether it's weather or things like that. And when we get into Russian 2, I try to find headlines that reflect some of, like if we're looking about participles, and every time the articles from a Ukrainian, although of course this has changed a lot, obviously, but until recently, there'd be a lot of times where the article that I found that was the best at illustrating this participle was from a Ukrainian site. And I just always make sure to point out to my students, that this site is actually Ukrainian, but it's written in Russian, or, this is an Israeli site written for Russian-speaking Israeli. So I try to, broaden that. One thing that my colleague at CMU, Tatiana Gashkovich, she, in our Russian 2 class, started a city project where every student is responsible for picking a city that is not St. Petersburg and Moscow, and having a little blog over it throughout the semester. And I, in the spring semester, I expanded that a little bit, and I had students pick a different country. So they could pick Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Israel, so a country where Russian is widely spoken. And they were responsible for, writing about that country in Russian, and they could choose to write about how Russians in that country live, or Russian speakers, or not at all, but just to try to expand it. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Jose?
Yeah, I think I'll just be kind of reiterating some of the things that have already been mentioned. And I wanted to preface what I say by acknowledging that I will probably never have the courage or the spirit to write a textbook myself. And I think there's some brilliant examples and things are getting better. But I think we can do even better yet. So for instance, last year, I think it was, when we got to the unit on holidays, talking about holidays, a student pointed out that they were all Christian holidays, which is neither representative of American students or the Russophone world. So I thought I found it, you know, really enlightening moment, that even a really new textbook had that oversight, let's call it. But again, you know, it's an opportunity to supplement, and I think that's a lot of what we do, supplementing textbooks and materials of all kinds, to broaden students' awareness of what the Russian-speaking world is like and who speaks Russian, the cultures, the backgrounds involved, in all of these things. And in this case, yeah, we added vocabulary, and they learned some more out of it. Similarly with the weather unit, I also nudge them, encourage them to, well, I say pick cities other than Moscow, Petersburg, and encourage them to think even wider. And then the city presentation that we do, and it's always curious to see which cities and which options students gravitate to if we leave the choice up to them. It seems kind of split, that some of them will stay to primarily Russia, but others will go to or choose Tbilisi or somewhere in Kazakhstan, for instance. But anyway, I found that really useful when the students have to do some kind of project or some sort of independent research or track things, to use that as opportunities, as has already been said, to show that they can look elsewhere. And then, maybe this is obvious as well, but I also wanted to mention pronouns. That's something that students are very aware of and interested in. So just from the start on our Moodle, my Moodle page, just posting some links, there's great resources that provide information about those or that topic. And even this fall semester, when we got to the marriage unit, there were so many questions about genders and gendered language and who can, выйти замуж, and how that all works out. But I think these are great learning moments for the student and for us. Yeah, and I don't know, really quickly, kind of stretching the bounds of the topic here. I also just wanted to mention my prison teaching. I teach in prisons, and while that's not specific to my background or language instruction, I think it speaks to how it's informed me thinking about encouraging students to share diverse lived experiences and points of view, because in these classes that I teach in prison, I take, in this case this semester, 13 Bryn Mawr students into a medium security prison to have conversations about Russian literature with 13 incarcerated students, and we'll talk about literary devices, we'll talk about our writing, work on our writing, but the main point, I would say, of this is that exchange. And I think that can also happen in the language classroom when we, open it up and let students choose topics and explore and share what's important to them, and present their different points of view, and also learn about different points of view in the Russian-speaking world.
Okay, excellent. So, and we get into the last question, although I know that David has already somewhat addressed it. It's about your experience studying Russian abroad. So the question would be, how did you prepare for studying in a Russian-speaking country? What do you wish you know before you went? And I think final would be even more important. It's like, how could your teachers of Russian have helped you? Or how would you have helped your students if you were your teacher, sending them to study abroad? And I think just to add on now in the current context, because we know, and this comes from David's comment, how he ended up traveling also to Ukraine and then to Uzbekistan, right, to Central Asia. So because it's more likely that many of our students will end up studying Russian now in Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, right, all these different post-Soviet countries which offer Russian program, Russian study abroad program. So how would you prepare them using your own experiences, both positive and negative? Raquel.
Okay, so I will start by saying that in all the years that I have traveled to Russia, rarely, very extremely rarely am I raised as Black. And when I tell people that I am Black, you know, it's just sort of like, well, who told you that? And I said, well, my mom, my dad, part of a Black family. It's just I'm raised as a lot of other things often. And I can't, when I talk to my students, I can't pretend that that hasn't affected my experience. So, you know, I've had occasions when, you know, I've tried to talk, or we've, you know, tried to have conversation about what they might experience, you know, during their study there. And, you know, one student said, but Professor Green, and they halted. And I said, I'm there with you. I know where this is going. I know where this is going. Your Black isn't my Black, right? Let's just start there. I can only share my lived experiences, and I understand that they may not be what you experience. But these are the things that I just want you to keep in mind. And I go back to what you have experienced as a person of color in this country, and how you navigate those daily micro or macro aggressions, and use those skills to empower you while you are there. Even though, you know, I haven't really been put in a position of having to assert myself and who I am in certain ways. But yes, that's something that I really try to impress upon them, even though I haven't, you know, what I have experienced, I think in many ways has been a function of what I look like, right? How I'm raised. So.
Thank you, Raquel. This is really, really interesting. Sharing your own experiences, right? And acknowledging this and doing this up front. And this is my experience, and hoping the students will learn from this somehow. Okay, thank you, David.
Yeah. One thing I know I already spoke about studying abroad in some detail, but one thing I wanted to think about with everybody here is how so often these conversations about studying abroad are about safety and about you know, whether it will be safer here or safer there. But I just, reflecting on my own experience, I felt safer in Moscow and in Kiev. But in terms of like my identity as an Asian American or half Japanese, I felt more secure in Irkutsk. That makes sense. Like, Irkutsk felt more dangerous to me, but it was not at all because of my ethnic identity. So I think so when we have these discussions with our students about studying abroad, I think we do definitely, of course, have to put our students' safety, keep that in mind primarily, but also remind ourselves that, you know, they could feel safer in a certain city, but have a certain amount of stress or certain issues should arise for reasons that have nothing to do with safety and more about, you know, the questions people ask them or the way people treat them. And then reflecting on the broader question, one thing that I think is extremely difficult, especially every year from year to year as I get older and older, but I wish that my Russian classes in the US had prepared me a little bit more for communicating or just with other young Russians. I think I wasn't aware of the differences in friendship, the differences, you know, without resorting to stereotypes, but just the differences in the way that people, you know, men and women relate in a friendship, in terms of friendships in Russia. you know, who you can make friends with most easily in Russia, how to do it, even things like how people text, things like that, which are very difficult for me now to tell my students because I'm old. But if I wonder if there's a way to have our students communicate with Russian students before they go abroad so they can get used to that. I think it would help them tremendously because obviously one of the best ways to learn language is to have Russian friends. And the sooner they do that, if they're only there for a semester, you know, if it takes them 7 weeks to find a Russian peer that can, you know, their age to speak with, because you don't want to. I spent a lot of time initially speaking with my host mother, which was great, but you know, I think that my Russian was a certain aged, kind of aged woman's Russian. That's the kind of Russian that I first soaked up when I got to Russia. So I think if there's ways to have our students speak more with younger Russians, I also think it will help them feel a little bit better about going abroad if they spoke to somebody their age earlier. But again, that's very difficult to arrange, especially now, but I think that's something that I would like to try to start more in my programs.
Yeah. So thank you. Definitely the pragmatics, right? The pragmatics of learning Russian and teaching Russian should not be ignored, and nowadays maybe even more and more important. Yeah. Jose?
Yeah, I think my remarks here will be briefer. You know, I was thinking, looking back, whether or how I prepared to study in Russian. I feel like I didn't prepare enough or at all. It was just something I was excited for, and you know, was thrilled to have the opportunity to do. After coming to the States again when I was about 6, I hadn't left the country, hadn't really traveled much, so it just seemed like a grand adventure, as study abroad usually does, I think. But I also want to acknowledge that comes from a place of privilege. You know, I didn't have to worry about passing or about safety issues necessarily in the ways others do. I think that that's important to recognize. So I experienced some kind of like general annoyance with Americans or American students at times, but that happens. And I think here I'm just offering a question or a reiteration of what Olga already said. I was struggling with this question given the current circumstances with the war, and that we're not sending students to Russia, probably not for the foreseeable future. And I know even in last number of years, we've been sending fewer students there. Our flagship students at Bryn Mawr have been going to Kazakhstan for a few years now, and so on. So while I feel like I have the lived experience, and can offer kind of concrete advice, practical advice about living and studying in Russia, I'm kind of at a loss when a student is going to Georgia, as we had one do last summer, this past summer, or other places, Latvia, Kazakhstan, etc. And there's established programs there like Flagship, etc. There's colleagues who do site visits who have experiences in these countries, these locations. But I also don't want to overwhelm them, and I don't want the pressure to fall on a limited pool necessarily, in terms of seeking advice. So I think, for me, speaking for myself, this seems like a moment for re-education or self-education of a sort, to kind of be able to offer my students, more concrete, firmer, more reliable advice about what it's like to study in these countries. There's overlap, certainly. There's the post-Soviet shared experience, but they're very different places, and I know that. So I would love to hear what others have come up with, and how maybe we can support each other and share resources when it comes to these new options or expanded options for study abroad.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So we have actually about a little bit over 20 minutes left, and I'm offering the two paths. The first one, this will be just the follow-up questions to any of our presenters, right? You've heard a lot today from them, and if you would like maybe to get more details, or maybe ask them to expand a little bit on one or the other aspect. And the second part would be for us as a community, as a group, to start reflecting on the following question. And we don't forget, we will continue this in our next meeting of the Teachers Lounge. So it's how might we adapt our teaching practices on the basis of what we have heard today from Raquel, David, and Jose, right? So these are the three themes or two themes, kind of the conclusions that we are drawing from all these experiences today. And the second one is any follow-up questions you have to any presenters individually. So raise your hand. You can raise either your virtual hand or you can raise your real hand. And I can see right now we have Irina.
Thank you. Thank you to the three presenters, David, Jose, Raquel. Thank you. I have a follow-up question for all of you. When you started taking Russian, and inevitably the question comes up in one of the chapters, национальность. What did you learn? What words were offered to you to identify yourself? And did you, if you can remember that, do you wish, did the teacher do what you wanted the teacher to do? Were you put on the spot too much? Were you offered the right kinds of words? Did you have enough vocabulary to talk about yourselves?
I could start. I remembered that actually the first problem was that I asked my teacher how to say Alaskan, because especially at that point in college, that was how I, one of my primary identities was Alaskan. So I think we said an Alyaskinets, but it sounded strange to my Russian teacher, Tatiana Eduardovna, so I didn't really use it that much. But I think I just said Amerikanets. I don't think I said Yaponska Amerikanets, or I think actually no, I had this conversation. Amerikanets Японского происхождения. I think I practiced that before going abroad, not seriously, but I do also remember a very good conversation I had with my host mother about my passport. We were looking at our passports, and she was surprised that there wasn't a field in there. Says, where does it say Japanese? I said, it doesn't say Japanese anywhere. And that's something I do. At least if I have the opportunity, I share that with my students to say that in Russia today and in the Soviet Union, you had an official nationality, one nationality in your passport. I think that's something that they find really interesting as well.
Do you have Raquel or Jose?
Jose, Raquel?
When I was learning, it was just Amerikanets, Amerikanka, and maybe at one point Afroamerikanka, but it didn't feel, it just felt strange to me using it. It was just Amerikanka, and that was.
That's similar for me, Amerikanets, and then откуда вы, из Колумбии or East Texasa. What is semi-related, but what just came to mind was I only learned much later that Colombia and Russia have a visa agreement. So if I had known that, if I had accepted my Colombian identity and gotten my Colombian passport earlier, my life would have been so much easier.
Thank you for sharing. The reason I'm asking is because so it comes up as nationalность. And first of all, we need to engage in this whole conversation about what nationalность means in Russian versus nationality in the United States. So I have to give them words like гражданство, национальность, происхождение. And several years ago, I started teaching my students to say по происхождению я. And then, so не по национальности, because I realized that this is much more important. And then the second thing that I can't believe that I didn't really think about it until this year, that we have nothing in our textbooks, and I was not doing this until this year, about hyphenated identities. Like we did not, like Raquel, I wonder when you say it just felt weird to say Afroamericanka, like why? Maybe because it's not there, it's just not in the textbook. So and David, in your case, or in all of your cases, because in your case too, like if we need to start recognizing the fact, I think Jose, you mentioned that at some point, that we're getting our student body is much more diverse, and they are more likely to be hyphenated Americans than maybe 30 years ago, who would come to our classrooms, I don't know, and we're not giving them hyphenation. So that's why I asked if that's kind of something that we as a field need to be thinking about. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have John, and after John we have Lee.
I think Lee was first. Lee, go ahead.
I wanted to ask that question as well. By the way, the Между нами textbook does have the гражданство and национальность, which I think is really good and interesting. And it gives you that whole opportunity, as you said, Irina, to talk about how nationalность, like it's very different in Russia than it is here. Even different in terms of how it's stamped in the passport, right? And then how it impacts people's, once you're, within the country, people talking about your nationality. So we do have that whole conversation. And I was just wondering, like when I was a student as well, we were taught, американец, whatever, итальянского происхождения. Like people were given that even, by our, TAs or professors. And so I've wondered, and not that we have to go with what's more appropriate in Russian necessarily, but what is, because I've thought about that, like, is it better to teach them to hyphenate, or better to teach them that phrase, better to give them that option? But even if I give them that option in Russian, what are the different implications of that option? I'm not really sure, like how Russians understand that. I have heard our Black students say, because when we grew up also, African-American was the term that Blacks preferred to be called, and now it has turned to Black. And so again, some of my Black students have pushed or have said, no, I don't want to be Afroamericanец. So, that whole interesting thing, what I have done is had them write down on a flashcard what words they would like or how they would like to identify, and then giving them that language. Because, that's the thing too, is jumping to that assumption. So that's one thing I wanted to say about that, and to say that in all three of you, I've so appreciated, there's been kind of this thread of not boxing students in. I think those were the words Jose used. And then Raquel used Raquel, that was so helpful to say what skills, get them to talk about what skills they've used here to deal with microaggressions, and even talk through that and say you can use those same skills. Because I hadn't ever thought of that. And I've hesitated with the other thing, Raquel, that you do is to show them the overly negative imagery, because I don't want to scare them and make them not want to go abroad. That's my first reason. And then the second reason is when I ask my Black students or my students of Asian heritage or Asian students what their experiences have been, they've been vastly different. Like the way they interpret or how they've even what experiences they've had, what microaggressions they have noticed, how people have related to them. One student to the next has very different stories and very different emotional impacts. And so in a way, that's almost made it so I feel like I don't want to tell them what they're going to experience, because that could be entirely incorrect. And that was something that you guys all said, but it also leaves me like a little bit like, oh, what do I tell them? I should tell them something. And like the more stories I get, the less I know what to say. So I'm wondering, I liked, Raquel, what you said, that is one more tool. And to just ask, do you have any more advice for that? So that's a question and a comment.
Well, I know, I'm not muted. Well, and I'll go back to something I think I said earlier, was that you should go to Russia expecting to come back having had a really great experience. but understand that while you are there, it's possible that these things will happen. And just, be prepared to use your skills, and hopefully you won't have to, right? So that's probably, I think, the best advice that I can give them in a nutshell. Knowledge is power, preparation is power, but let's hope that you won't have to use those skills, right? Because you're right, you don't want to present this overly negative picture and to scare them or to turn them off to the idea of traveling abroad. But you just want them to be aware. And I feel that that's what my job is, right? To just make them aware.
I just want to chip in and say that I do think it's difficult for me as well, because I don't want to give advice about, or tell what their experience might be when my experience will be completely different. But one thing that I always want to tell my students, where I can speak from my own experience and not, assume for them, is that, going abroad really tests and I think really strengthens your own identity, at least in my experience. And I'm not talking about ethnicity now, but I am, cisgender, straight guy, but it wasn't until I spent a year in Russia that I really finally became comfortable, like, in my masculinity, if that makes sense. It was something about going to Russia and actually seeing in Irkutsk, seeing the way that people perform their masculinity all the time, at the bus stop wearing these, wearing all black. It made me finally comfortable in being not as masculine as I thought I should be. And so it wasn't, I think I can tell my students, I can't say you will, be treated this way or that way, but it made me feel more confident by making me feel more vulnerable, if that makes sense. And I hope that they can all have that experience. And I do think that can be a more universal experience than me saying, oh, they'll think that you're this or that, don't worry, or you should worry about, it is difficult because you don't know how they will be accepted there. Right? And you don't want to tell them one way or the other.
Thank you, John. You ready for your question?
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. This has been just really great. I just wanted to comment on what Irina said, back to her original question. I remember when I was learning Russian, starting to learn Russian. And yeah, I mean, it was just, the only thing that was available was, Amerikansky или Amerikanets. And I just wanted to say that sort of, didn't take into consideration, like what Irina said, происхождение. So like, for example, yes, you can say that you're American, but, is that really, sort of like a nationality? Is that really an identity, even to this day? Coming from a family where, I had a grandmother that came from Italy, another grandmother that came from, Quebec, so Italian speaking, French speaking, and then other relatives that came from Ireland. I wanted to be able to express all of that, but I wasn't given that terminology, so yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, Irina, what you were saying about equipping them, with, some other sort of terms so that they can express that, students can express that. I also wanted to just say that, there's just this whole topic of, identity. It's just so complex, and it takes so many things into consideration when we're asking about our students, origin, nationality, heritage, background. I've written them down, like life experience, ethnicity, race, everything. And I just think that, we just need to somehow, give them, the vocabulary to express that so that they feel comfortable and, content in what they're stating in the second language. And then I wish to just finish with the fact that, so I teach in middle school, in Connecticut, and I just remember having, as a language teacher, I remember having a conversation with a social studies teacher, and this had to do with nationality and citizenship. And I was told by the social studies teacher that there's no difference. And I tried very hard to explain that there is a difference. And, I just ended the discussion, I would say, because it didn't go into an argument with, well, there's two different words for it. So anyway, thank you very much. This has been really wonderful, guys. Thank you. So it's a great topic.
If I may actually, hopefully someone else will have another question, but this is actually a question which is relevant to me because right now we started a new chapter about appearance. And I know that Raquel mentioned this and David mentioned this, and I think all three presenters mentioned at some point, выгляжу как, не выгляжу как, I'm passing for this. And this is also interesting because this is like elementary students. Like I think that it's not as difficult to explain or have debates, discussions on the way how we look, how we don't look, how there are stereotypes at the more advanced levels. And then I have elementary 1 or 2, right? So they have very limited skills. And at the same time, I realized the textbook is not old. It's just came out like half a year ago or something like that, right? And then again, there is nothing there about like how to describe your appearance. And I feel like this is something. It's a more complex topic because appearance is already a sensitive topic, right? We have all this body positivity and we have all these stereotypes and we have all these complexes related to appearances and all this, I don't know, what fashion feeds us. Students might have already feel insecure because of how they look. That is not related to their ethnic belonging or any origin, right? Like race origin or anything, right? It's basically how they look, right? The color of the hair or something. And then the textbook does not support it at all because then I have a practical math. Like the question is the following: like at some point, my students are engaged in this virtual activity class. And they have to go and they pretend they use this VR goggles and they're supposed to meet another person from this Russian speaking country or city as if they were pen pals. They never saw each other, but they finally arrive at the location by some pamятник or something, or, monument. And they have to say, okay, so where are you? I cannot see you. Describe yourself, right? So there is the practical. It's not like I'm just like, let's talk about all the sensitive things, how you look like. No, it's the practical, right? Because to create in the station potential is like, oh, I'm there, I'm standing, I'm looking like this. This is like I have dark skin, I have light skin, I have curly hair, or I have straight hair. Nothing of this. Even in the intermediate Russian textbooks, I remember, right? So I always have to supplement. But this is something I also was wondering, like, whether I'm doing, is it actually what I'm doing is okay, or I'm kind of diving into the field which is too sensitive and too kind of dangerous. It's like when it comes to what people look like and their appearances, and especially when we start piling up all these different other layers, like, as I said, like race and I don't know, even being non-binary students, right? We have a lot of non-binary students nowadays. For them, at least I'm assuming it might be even more complex to describe themselves, especially if this is not like, if it's a fluid identity. And some of them, actually, I do have students who change it from day to day, right? Even the way how they look and what gender they affiliate themselves on that specific day. And so any kind of insight from your point of view, how to talk about appearances.
I think if we give the students, the opportunity to describe themselves, I think that's much better than having students, it's always dangerous to have, students describe each other, because they might say someone is light skinned or something. I do think skin can be a little difficult, but but on the other hand, there are certain things in Russian, just from appearance, that maybe have some kind of racial connection, maybe not. But, I didn't know, but I was told in Russian class that у меня черные глаза, не только карие глаза. So I can tell my students, it's that if you have very dark brown eyes, you can say you have черные глаза, because otherwise, if they go to Russia and someone says you have black eyes, they might be very confused by that. But, there's certain adjectives that exist in Russian that don't exist in English for describing skin tones, but I do think it could get very complex very quickly. So I don't know. But if they can describe themselves and they have a list and they can choose, I think that for most things that would be, I think, fine and very helpful for them to take it in, so they can describe themselves to others and take agency over that.
I would agree with all that and agree with the kind of difficulty that it comes when developing these sorts of materials. I always have this moment every semester where there is some body physical appearance vocabulary in the textbook, and I have a PowerPoint, or I introduce students to this vocabulary: curly hair, green eyes, whatever. In the figura part, I'm Googling like good figure, not so good figure, or whatever, and it always feels terrible. And I always just switch to English at that moment and apologize for what's going on. And that this is just what I found on the internet, which I guess is a learning moment, right? And you can use that to discuss societal expectations, I suppose, on some level, and even in second year Russian. We can kind of laugh about it and what's available on Google Images. But I don't know. I mean, I think the circumstances in which anyone is describing their own skin color are so they're rare, right? And you don't usually describe people by skin color. I think I would be surprised if anyone wants to be described by skin color, to be identified that way by someone else, I suppose, in particular. So I don't know. I mean, in second year, which is what I teach, it's more like, length of hair color, eye color, height, etc. On that sort of level, I think also just conceptually gets complex, as you were saying, Olga, and maybe race, those sorts of discussions, they're just harder to have at that level. I love what you said, Raquel, about how you are able to incorporate that in some of these issues at that level. This seems difficult. And the last thing I'll say is, in putting together these PowerPoints, some of them from grad school, at some point I realized some of them, I had adopted or received from the archive that we had. Just some of them, it's all white people for the examples, that like images for describing people. And it's just like something that no one had caught before or recognized. In some cases, I just didn't think about. So that's something that I'm much more intentional, especially when designing materials now and diversifying the representation in examples and PowerPoints, et cetera, and these images of hair color, whatever it might be, varying it up a lot more. So I don't know, that doesn't necessarily address your specific question, but I think it's related in ensuring that, again, the image, in this case, a literal image that we're presenting, it's not of Russian is for white people only or for a certain kind of person, but it can be for anyone and represented and represented by and represent a variety of people and backgrounds.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So it's 7 o'clock, and I would like to thank all our presenters today and also all the audience. So thank you, Jose. Thank you, Raquel. Thank you, David, for sharing these experiences. I know this was extremely beneficial for me. I've learned a lot. I took some mental notes for myself, how I can use these ideas in my language classroom. I also wanted to remind everyone that we are going to meet next Friday. It's going to be just regular 1 hour teachers lounge, and this will be our kind of concluding teachers lounge, where we will be discussing everything and maybe coming up with some more concrete ideas of how we can use all that stories, all these experiences about which we have heard over the past 2 roundtables in our own teaching practices, and also in our own language curriculum development projects and initiatives. Okay, so thank you so much, everyone.